We're not just talking about like small tweaks or updates. We're talking about bylaw changes.
Yeah, straight to the bylaws.
Exactly. And these weren't just like, slip through or anything. I mean, these were overwhelmingly approved by 92% of homeowners.
Wow, that is overwhelming support. Yeah,
I mean, I think that right there tells you we're talking about something pretty fundamental to how our community runs.
absolutely. I mean, when you get that level of agreement, it really signals that this is something that people care about and
Yeah.
wanted to see happen.
Yes. So we're gonna like really dive deep into this today, but just to set the stage, what's at the heart of these changes, and why I think they got that huge support
Yeah.
is this move to really shift power, over financial decisions, directly into the hands of us, the homeowners.
Absolutely. It's about giving the homeowners more control
Yeah.
over, the money, the finances of the community.
Right, and making sure that things are, transparent and accountable.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so interesting about these updated bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not just about, changing rules for the sake of it. It's really about empowering owners
Right.
and putting in safeguards to prevent any kind of, you know, overreach or potential issues down the line.
Exactly. And I think that's something that, the current board really deserves credit for because they really championed these updates.
Right.
And, their stated goal with this is to ensure that, the HOA is truly acting in the best interests of the homeowners.
Right.
So today's deep dive is really all about understanding these key changes, What do they actually mean for how our community finances are managed?
Mhm.
And why is this shift so important? And specifically, we're going to be looking at how these new rules really restrict the board's power, especially when it comes to spending our money.
All right, let's break it down. Let's start with how these changes ensure that every homeowner has a voice.
Yeah.
If you look at Section 3.5 of the new bylaws,
Okay.
it very clearly states that each lot gets one vote.
Mm.
So it's not about how many people live in a house or anything like that. It's one vote per lot.
Right. So it's really reinforcing that principle of, equal representation for every homeowner.
Exactly. Everyone has an equal say.
And I think to ensure that, everyone has a chance to have that say, to actually cast their vote, they've made some changes to the voting process itself.
Oh, interesting.
So all voting is now going to be done online.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there's going to be a minimum 50-day voting window.
No, a pretty long time.
A really long time, yeah.
So no excuse for not voting.
Exactly. It's designed to maximize participation, give everyone plenty of time, and also just make it really convenient.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a really long time. I mean, that must be intentional, right?
Absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
it really addresses some of those concerns about, accessibility and engagement.
Yeah, making sure everyone has a chance.
But they haven't forgotten about those who you might not be as comfortable online or might not have reliable internet access.
Right.
So they still have provisions for that. You can request a paper ballot if you need one.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. That's good to know.
Yeah. So they're really trying to be inclusive and make sure that everyone has a chance to participate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's get to what I think is probably the most, kind of pivotal part of these changes.
Okay, the juicy stuff.
Yeah, the juicy stuff, right. And that's the new spending limits.
Yeah, the money.
The money, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's detailed in Section 14.3 of the bylaws. And this is where we really start to see a tangible shift in financial control.
Okay.
Okay, so the headline here is this: the board can no longer spend more than $2,500 on any single project.
Wow. Okay, so a hard limit?
A hard limit.
So, like, even if, let's say, a big project, needs to happen, they can't just, like, break it up into a bunch of smaller invoices to get around that limit?
That's a great point. And the bylaws actually specifically address that.
Okay.
So even if a project is phased over time, that $2,500 limit applies to the entire scope of the project.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they really thought this through.
You really did. Yeah.
So no sneaky workarounds.
Exactly. So if we're looking at a major repair, let's say to the clubhouse or something,
Right.
even if they try to, break it down into stages, the total for that entire repair cannot exceed $2,500
Okay.
without getting additional approvals.
So that's where the homeowner power comes in, right?
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because the requirements for further approval
Yeah.
really give homeowners a lot more influence.
Okay.
So here's how it works. Okay.
Lay on me.
If any single project is going to be over $2,500,
Okay.
the board needs a unanimous vote to proceed.
Wow. So every single board member has to agree.
Every single one. Yeah, so that right there introduces a huge amount of scrutiny
Yeah,
and ensures that they're all on board.
absolutely.
But here's where it gets even more impactful for homeowners.
Okay.
Any total expenses that push the overall spending for the entire year
Okay.
above $5,000
Okay.
have to be approved by a majority vote of the homeowners
At a meeting, or how does that work?
at the annual meeting.
Yeah.
So at the scheduled annual meeting,
Got it. Got it.
the homeowners get to vote on it.
So this puts the big financial decisions directly in our hands.
Exactly. And I think sometimes these numbers, $2,500, $5,000, it's like, okay, what does that actually mean?
Right. It's hard to visualize.
Yeah, so let's put it into a really clear example.
I like examples.
Yeah. So imagine our HOA's annual budget is $10,000.
Right.
Okay? Under these new bylaws,
Mm-hmm.
the board can only spend $1,000
Okay.
on a single project without either needing every single board member to agree, or if that project or a series of smaller projects ends up pushing the total spending for the year over $5,000, then they need a majority vote from us, the homeowners.
So it's basically like a 10% cap on their independent spending power
Exactly.
for any single item,
Exactly.
unless they get that extra layer of approval.
That's exactly right. And I think that's a really big change.
That is huge. Yeah.
It is huge. And they've also taken into account the fact that, inflation is a thing.
Of course.
These spending thresholds are going to increase by 2% every year,
Okay.
starting in 2026.
Okay.
So they've built in that long-term view as well.
Smart.
Yeah. So it's not going to be like, in 10 years, suddenly $2,500 is nothing.
Right.
It's gonna adjust over time.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the spending limits.
Mhm.
That's kind of the big headline, I think.
The big change. Yeah.
But there's other important aspects of spending approval that we need to look at as well. So
Sure.
Section 14.2 really reinforces this accountability. And it states very clearly that no single board member can just decide to spend HOA funds on their own.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's not like, I'm on the board, I'm going to go buy this.
Exactly. Any expenditure needs prior approval.
Okay.
And that approval can come in two ways.
Okay.
Either through the annual budget, which of course we as homeowners vote on,
Right.
or by a majority vote of the entire board.
Okay.
So it prevents any one person from making a financial decision.
Right. So it has to be a group decision.
Exactly.
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances, exactly. And it doesn't stop there.
More checks and balances.
More checks and balances.
Yeah.
So Section 14.4, this is where they introduce what they're calling dual oversight.
Dual oversight. I like the sound of that.
Yeah, it's a pretty catchy name, right?
Yeah.
And this is really about adding another layer of financial control.
Okay.
So what's really key here is that all financial transactions,
Okay.
so that's disbursements, transfers, any kind of adjustment.
Right. So moving money around.
Exactly. They now need either authorization from two separate people
Okay.
or approval from the entire membership
All right.
through the annual budget vote.
So it's not just one person signing off on things.
Exactly. So one person can't just decide to, transfer money out of an account or something like that.
It's like having two signatures on a check.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to further reinforce that, they're also mandating that at least two board members have to be authorized signatories on all HOA bank accounts.
So again, you can't just have one person with all the power.
Exactly. It's a really simple measure, but it's really effective, I think, in mitigating that risk of, potential financial mismanagement.
Absolutely. And on top of all that, they're also increasing transparency.
Yes.
So the bylaws now require that HOA financial statements be presented to the membership at least twice a year,
Okay.
and they also have to be available online.
Great. So we can all see them.
Yeah, so everyone can easily access them and review the financial information.
So much better than like having to request it or something.
Exactly. It's all about keeping the community informed and engaged.
Right. We've gone through like a lot of details here.
A lot of details.
But I think it's important to kind of step back for a moment.
Zoom out.
Zoom out. Yeah. And look at the bigger picture.
The big picture.
What does all of this mean for our HOA?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that these bylaw changes represent a really fundamental shift in how our community is governed.
Right. And I think it's a shift in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it historically, it's like we're moving away from this kind of top-down approach to something that's much more collaborative and owner-driven.
Owner-led. Exactly.
Owner-led, yeah.
And it's not just about, warm, fuzzy feelings. It's about actually giving homeowners more control.
Real power.
Real power. Yeah, especially when it comes to financial matters.
The money, yeah.
And And I think it's important to remember, these changes weren't just like imposed on us.
Right.
This was something that the current board, really pushed for.
Yeah, they were the driving force behind it.
Exactly. And their goal with this is to, strengthen owner rights and ensure greater transparency and accountability in everything the HOA does.
Yeah, prevent those situations where it feels like the HOA is working against the homeowners
Exactly.
rather than for them.
Exactly. So to kind of sum it all up,
Okay, the big takeaway.
the big takeaway here is that thanks to these changes, the ones that were overwhelmingly approved.
Right, 92%.
92%.
Yeah,
Can't forget that.
we the homeowners now have much more control over financial decisions.
Much more say in how things are run.
Exactly, and the board's ability to spend on single projects is limited.
Yeah, that 10% cap.
That 10% cap, exactly. So with our $10,000 budget, they can only spend $1,000 without those extra approval steps.
So it's a big deal.
It's a really big deal, and I think it really changes the whole landscape of financial control within our HOA.
Absolutely. And I think for anyone who wants to really dig into the details,
Yeah.
the full updated bylaws are available on the HOA website.
Right, easy to find.
Easy to find, yeah. And I encourage everyone to take a look because, it's important to be informed
Absolutely, and it's more important than ever now to stay engaged.
now that we have this power.
Exactly right. So